Mark chapter 5 and verse 21. This is after Jesus has just come back from the other side of the Lake Galilee. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched my clothes?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, this is one of those stories you find in Luke's Gospel sometimes when it's a bit like a sandwich. There's a story happening, and then in the middle of that story, there's another one. And so we start off with a big crowd heading off to the synagogue leader's house because there's a 12-year-old girl there who's dying. And of course, everybody's following Jesus in the huge crowd. That's why we've been talking about, getting lost in the crowds today. And then in the middle of this crowd is somebody who actually didn't want to be noticed in the crowd. This woman, for 12 years, in other words, the entire lifetime of Jairus' daughter, has been suffering from bleeding. Now that, apart from being very debilitating, because, if your bleeding goes on for 12 years, you're going to be pretty drained. But the other problem was that for a lady in that culture, while a woman is bleeding, even in the normal way of things, she's considered to be ritually unclean. So, everything she sits on or lies on becomes ritually unclean. Nobody must touch her because she's ritually unclean. She couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She was really quite shut out from society. And that happened for most women on a regular basis, as those of us who were there can know. But for this woman, this has been going on constantly for 12 years. And apart from the physical debilitating effects, it's meant that she's been socially ostracized for 12 years. She's been somebody that nobody wants to touch for fear of getting contaminated for 12 years. No wonder she's desperate. And she's spent every penny she had on various attempts to find a cure. There were doctors in those days. Let me add, they would all have been men. There are some things, where you don't want to go to a man doctor if you're a woman, but there was no option then. And of course, medicine wasn't quite as advanced as now, and they didn't have anesthetics and, nice little tablets you could take. It said in one of the other Gospels, she had suffered much under the care of many doctors. So she had tried everything that human medicine could produce with no effect, all that suffering for nothing. So this woman is desperate. But of course, she doesn't want to be seen in the crowd because she shouldn't be in the crowd. Everybody who touches her is actually technically now ritually unclean. And as for the idea of approaching Jesus, and suggesting that she might contaminate him by asking him to lay hands on her. Well, she couldn't do that. So this is a woman who wants to be hidden. But she's also a woman who knows, because all that she's heard, she knows that Jesus has the answer for her, that he could actually make the difference. This is part of our series on people who had an encounter with Jesus that changed their life. And for this woman, she knew that's what could happen for her. So she thinks, if I just sneak up in the crowd and just touch the hem of his cloak, I'll be healed. Tells you how firmly she believed that he could do this for her. And so she sneaks up. Now that must have been quite a determined effort. As I say, my experience of the crowd was at Leicester Square Underground Station, and we were trying to get out, and it was a nightmare. In a crowd you can't move. And I would imagine that Jairus at this point is getting desperate because the crowds are here and he wants Jesus to get quickly to his house. And, you know, it's all going so slow because of the crowd. And now, suddenly, this happens and delays everything even further. He must have been really annoyed. But she reaches out, and the minute she touched his garment, she knew something has changed. I've been healed. It's happened. Wow, this is just amazing. Now I need to slip away quietly, you know, before anybody notices. But Jesus stops, because contrary to what in fleshly terms should have happened, her contamination didn't arrive in him. He didn't feel something come in. She felt something come in, because for him, he felt his power go out. Tells us, you know, that for Jesus, actually healing the sick was actually quite a draining and costly experience. But he felt the power go out. He knew something had gone out from him. That's why she was healed and he wasn't contaminated. Her contamination was gone, and his wholeness and his purity came and filled her. And he felt it go and she felt it come. And he stops, even though they're in a tearing rush to get there before this girl dies. And he says, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, realistically, if you're in a rugby scrum, who touched you? Well, everybody did, didn't they? And that's why when Jesus stops and says, you know, who touched me? His disciples are saying, come on, everybody's touching you. You know, you're being jostled left, right, and centre. But he knew this is not just jostling. This person has reached out to me, and he knew. And so that woman is actually trembling in fear. She's thinking, oh no, I've been rumbled. And she has to come out in front of everybody and explain what has happened. Now you might think, well, why did he do that? Why embarrass her like that? But you see, she could have gone away knowing she was healed. How would you explain that to the priest in order to convince them that you could now come into the temple? You would have to tell somebody, wouldn't you? And actually, Jesus is not in the business of, you know, doing things clandestinely. And when we receive from Jesus, yes, it happens to us privately in the depths of our hearts, but it needs to be acknowledged publicly. We need to not only know in our hearts that Jesus is Lord, but we need to confess with our mouth that God raised him from the dead. We need actually to share that testimony, because we need to give the glory where it's due. And of course the other thing was, this woman who all this time has been shunned and rejected, now she comes before Jesus and she's not told off. She's actually affirmed and praised for the faith that she's displayed. He's actually said to her, no, your faith is of the life-changing kind. Now, it's not that faith has some magic powers. Let's get that really straight. There is no magic power in faith. The power belongs to the Lord. But our faith is like the channel through which it can flow, which gives it the opportunity to come to the place where it's needed. His power, but when we reach out in faith, we meet his power. And this woman has just discovered that. And now, publicly, this woman who all this time has been shunned, has been acknowledged and affirmed. And you know, he says something to her which he has not recorded in scriptures as ever saying to anybody else. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace." There is not one other recorded instance in the New Testament anywhere of Jesus actually addressing somebody as daughter. He's on his way to save Jairus' daughter. And Jairus, as I say, was, I expect, very anxious and upset because there was a delay and he wanted him to get there quickly. "It's my daughter, don't you understand?" And it's like Jesus is saying, "You are my daughter, you're part of my family. You're just as important to me as the synagogue leader's child or the centurion or whoever else important comes by." He says, "You're just as important to me. And actually, you're part of my family." We read some while back about the time when Mary and Jesus' brothers came to try and take charge of him and take him off. And they're outside the house sort of saying, "Tell him we're here." And they say, "Your mother and brothers are outside." And he says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" All these people here. Whoever is responding to the word, they're my mother and my brothers. And here he says to this woman, "You're my daughter." And later we read that we are adopted into his family. Now, how much more life-changing could that be? Doesn't matter what sort of background you've come from. Some of us have had a very blessed family. Others have had a really rough deal in terms of our families. But wherever you've come from, once you've met with Jesus, you're part of a new family. You've been born again. You've been made new. And the whole of life has changed. And all that takes is the willingness to reach out to him in our desperation. And I can absolutely guarantee you, for anyone who's doing that today, you will not be lost in the crowd. He will know, and he will respond.